From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the gendered impact of the coronavirus pandemic. While the virus has affected everyone, its impact on women and girls has been outsized, and the fallout from it will likely exacerbate a host of existing issues affecting everything from health and education to politics and the economy. To help better understand this important issue, we're joined today by three great guests: Hafsa Halawa, Burcu Karakas, and Lina AbiRafeh. Hafsa is a non-resident scholar at MEI and an independent consultant working on political, social, and economic affairs and development goals across the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Burcu is a non-resident scholar at MEI, an independent investigative journalist based in Istanbul, and the Turkey correspondent for Germany's international broadcaster Deutsche Welle. Lina is the executive director of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University. She spent over 20 years in development and humanitarian contexts in countries around the world and is an expert in gender-based violence prevention and response. Hafsa, Burcu, Lina, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Lina, coming into this crisis, the MENA region was already facing a host of challenges, from humanitarian crises to civil wars, that have disproportionately affected women. Can you give us a sense of the situation pre-COVID, as well as the new challenges the pandemic has created?
Absolutely. Well, pre-COVID, the situation is already pretty dire. As you might already know, the region ranks the lowest globally in terms of social indicators, the widest gender gaps, the greatest risks to women, peace, and security, high rates of insecurity due to protracted crises. We're talking about refugee populations and internally displaced, many of whom are women and children. We're talking about lack of legislation or discrimination in legislation across the board in the region for women. And where legislation exists, it is ignored or unapplied, actively discriminating against women's rights and denying them their rights in the economy and access to public life, in terms of protections from all forms of violence, in terms of gender-based violence, which is an area I focus on quite specifically, that is extremely vast across the region. Intimate partner violence affects a third of women, if not more. It's always underreported, and there are no systems of protection or prevention for those types of things. Women in economic life are dramatically underrepresented, and where they are in feminized sectors and relegated to the informal economy. Human rights abuses in the region, not just women and Arab women, but also female migrant domestic workers. We've been hearing a lot about that recently. So we have a lot of issues. It's a really challenging place to be, but an important time to push harder for some meaningful gains for women. And unfortunately, this pandemic has created a huge setback and made it much more challenging for us to be able to recover.
So the pandemic has taken an especially great toll on economies and livelihoods, as lockdown measures have been imposed and business has slowed down or ground to a halt. What do we know about the economic impact on women across the region so far?
Thanks, Alistair. Well, I think one of the major issues in terms of tackling this question of gendered impact of COVID across all the different parameters that Lina has pointed out and that you've asked me is the lack of gender disaggregated data or sex disaggregated data to be able to really understand, particularly, for example, women in the formal labor force, how layoffs, redundancies, and so on may have affected them. But we can certainly make some projections based on the fact that women already have a larger majority share of the burden of what we would call sort of household tasks, sort of cleaning, caring for the household, childcare, and so forth. And certainly for many families, we've had schools suspended, both in the public and private sector across the region since effectively March, and no schools sort of returning until earliest end of August, September. So the question of childcare, being able to work and care for your children at the same time, particularly for women who work outside of the home, who aren't able to, shift their practices to either online work from home methods or have to balance and sacrifice having forms of childcare whilst they go out to work. So certainly in terms of economic impact and livelihoods, we do know and expect that that's going to heavily affect women. And even as what we would call the easing measures of COVID start to come into place. We've seen already easings of curfews, of lockdowns, certain businesses starting to open up, businesses where possible beginning to return their staff. The major problem is that the questions of childcare, the questions of educational facilities, education support, etc., even as we look further towards September, is still very, very unclear. So women are left much more burdened with the immediate and with the short and medium term effects on livelihoods specifically, because there is no particular pathway or plan or trajectory with which we can plan ahead and understand better how women can mitigate that within balancing both sort of their home obligations or the more traditional roles that one assumes for women within sort of that particular thinking and livelihoods in general.
Lina, what about the longer term impact? How are women likely to be affected by the fallout from the pandemic and kind of the broader structural shifts in the economy?
Well, the challenge is that women already are underrepresented, and where they are, as I mentioned, they face discrimination, lack of protections, and so on. We don't have family-friendly workplace policies. Women who leave, who are at work, don't return. So all of these things that were already mentioned. My biggest concern is that women will be forced to enter the informal economy or resort to riskier survival strategies in order to survive for themselves and for their families. So we're talking about increase in things like transactional sex also as a result of these types of economic shocks that are happening. So women and girls as well will have to do whatever it takes in order to survive. And my bigger concern is the women and girls who are already vulnerable and marginalized. So we're talking about refugee populations or any kinds of ethnic or religious minorities, other populations that already have a very difficult time in accessing opportunities that should rightfully be theirs. So I think the challenge is ahead of us to be able to reform these types of policies and look at how to provide professional development opportunities, how to ensure that women are able to enter legitimate economic opportunities, trainings, support, and family-friendly policies that are going to bring them into work and keep them there. Otherwise, I think the region is going to suffer overall because the fact that women are dramatically underrepresented works to the detriment of the entire Arab region.
Burcu, in many countries around the world, we've seen a sharp rise in the level of domestic violence during the lockdown. What's happening in Turkey specifically, and what's the government doing about it?
The government here, they will actually say that there is no rise in domestic violence, of course, which is not true. During the lockdown, we have seen that they actually declared the numbers of the incidents, which was really surprising. But then we saw that the reason they did that, because they say that there has been a decrease actually in these numbers. So they want to show the public that, just because there is a great pressure coming from the women's movement saying that they are not doing enough to prevent the femicide. And they just want to say that it is not true, but which is not working. So the public here, they don't believe in. It's just so obvious that almost every day, at least a woman is killed here. So it is really one of the most important problems in Turkey. But they are just turning a blind eye. So they are ignoring this problem. One of the main reasons for this is that they are really afraid that once the women, they are going to raise their voices, the families are going to be torn apart. And that's the last thing that they want. Because as you know, the AKP government in Turkey, they are really conservative. All of their policies, it's based on the family unit. So that's why they just want to, suppress women here. They ignore the rights of the women and like the individual rights. But every time they speak of the women's rights, they're talking about this issue in regard to the family. So that's why we unfortunately see the numbers are really high in Turkey. But we have this luck that the women's movement in Turkey is really strong. So that's why there is an ongoing debate in public about the violence against women. It's actually the reason that the women's organizations, they just want to keep this debate open. And so I think it's the luck here in Turkey.
Lina, do you have anything you want to add here?
Absolutely. Building on the Turkey example, what's happening across the region also is very dangerous and it's going to have long-term repercussions. The different forms of violence that we're seeing, definitely intimate partner violence, but also the increased risk of sexual exploitation and abuse, trafficking, risks specifically for girls. And then the challenges that we didn't ever have in the region overall, a lot of resources and safe spaces and opportunities for prevention and protection for gender-based violence for women and girls. And those where they did exist were already overstretched, hardly available. And now they have been, in many cases, kind of hijacked or repurposed to use for the COVID response. So whatever scant resources we did have, we hardly have. And then what we're seeing are new forms of violence against women as well. Like in Lebanon, the increase of cyber harassment or online sexual harassment. Palestine, a massive increase in suicide attempts due to domestic violence situations. And then in countries that are experiencing protracted crises, all of this is even worse. So just to add that this is a region-wide phenomenon that looks like it needs a massive concerted response.
Hafsa, the MENA region is also home to both active conflicts like Libya, for example, Syria and Yemen, as well as post-conflict environments like Iraq. I'm curious, what additional challenges do women and girls in these contexts face as a result of the pandemic?
So there are obviously the direct effects of the pandemic, and primarily because of the conflict, because of the destruction to many areas, because of the mass displacement, both within borders and across borders for the IDP and refugee communities, the access to healthcare question is exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Women and children make up the vast majority of those displaced from conflict across the world, but particularly, obviously, we've seen that in Syria and in Iraq and in Libya and Yemen. So the access to healthcare question, we already had this issue with access to healthcare. It was very, very acute for maternal health, pediatric care, and so forth, where those who'd been displaced or those who'd remained in areas of origin that had been completely destroyed were unable to access the kind of primary, secondary, or tertiary healthcare they required and had to travel, in some cases, particularly for, say, Iraq's displaced, across borders into Syria and vice versa. So certainly the problem being that we already have a weakened healthcare system in these countries that are subjected to conflict, but also sort of looking down or looking further into the longer term problems. The immediacy or the urgent required attention to the COVID pandemic is going to divert attention away from the really very urgent needs of women, whether they be sort of displaced into host communities, whether they be displaced into refugee camps or IDP camps. And what we're going to see is a rise in things like sexual exploitation, extortion, and arguably early marriage of young girls, and certainly the lack of educational access for young girls and children generally. These are already challenges that were very, very acute for the conflict countries. It's easier to assess that in a country like Iraq in a post-conflict landscape than to say what is happening with the conflict so actively ongoing in Libya and others. So it's harder to assess. But primarily when you have active conflict, you're mixing in a pandemic, mass spread, lack of access to healthcare, whilst effectively the bombs are dropping and people are fleeing their homes at the same time. So there's all kinds of human insecurity it's exacerbated. But just to emphasize the point, these are not challenges or problems that were not there prior to the pandemic, or were not as important, or were not as acute or urgent prior to the pandemic. These are massively important issues. They are very urgent issues that need to be addressed, have not been addressed by the host countries themselves, haven't been addressed enough by support from the international community beyond aid and service delivery. So there needs to be a sort of heightened focus of attention to make sure that within the pandemic, we're not just looking at poorer communities, rural communities, those with lack of access, but there is a very specific lens focused on those displaced or affected by conflict generally.
Burcu, you spoke earlier about the Turkish government's failure to address the issue of violence against women. I'm curious, on a policy level, what changes would you like to see made? And have there been any recent developments that are promising or encouraging on that front? If not from the national government, perhaps on the local level or among NGOs?
So actually, everything is perfect on paper in Turkey. The implementation is really problematic, though. The reason is that, as I have mentioned earlier, there is no political will to implement policies. Again, the reason goes back just because the government is really, I can say that actually, it's afraid of the women. And so that's why they are trying to, prevent even the feminist movement being more inclusive. But of course, it's not working. There is no plan of the government to stop the violence against women in Turkey. But as I said, everything is in place. So I think we need more public pressure, which is already there. The government is really actually widely criticized by the women's organization, and not only by the women, but also from the other groups in society. Leave aside that any improvement or any encouraging improvement, the Turkey is right now even trying to withdraw the Istanbul Convention, which is the Council of Europe's Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women, which is, of course, is trying to be prevented by the women's movement here in Turkey. So the women's movement in Turkey is the strongest opposition here. So which means that still NGOs, they are really encouraging, the women to raise their voices. So this is also affecting the local governments at some points. But unfortunately, no, I'm not expecting in the short term anything from the national front to prevent the problem going worse. But I am optimistic in the sense that the women's organization and the women's movement actually will keep the debate open. And so they are going to get more attention from the public.
Lina, we've covered a number of different challenges arising from the pandemic, and they are certainly significant. But in your view, are there any potential opportunities that might come out of this as well?
Absolutely. There is actually a silver lining. I think what has happened with everybody in lockdown, working from home, sheltering in place, and all these concepts that now form a part of our normal vocabulary, I think this places some recognition and value of women's work, both in formal workplaces and at home. So the idea that this kind of work-life balance, that we existed in these parallel streams that never intersected, where we had all these responsibilities on the home front and then everything in the office stayed in the office and the two never met, I think has been debunked at last. So the idea is finally that we can integrate all of these different aspects of our lives, and the ability to work from home, which I think will continue for a long time post-pandemic, telecommuting, flexible work schedules, all of these things build in the recognition that we have multidimensional lives. This is much better for women. This also allows them to manage their own schedules, work on a deliverables-based kind of methodology, and at the same time, not feel like they are working two jobs. And I think the upside of that additionally is that men, I am hoping, will assume greater share of family and domestic life, not as an exception or as a favor, but actually out of responsibility, and the sense that they do have an obligation at home, and they recognize, now that they're experiencing it firsthand, how challenging that is. So I can't say that we're seeing it en masse as yet, but I think a longer term impact is going to be that men within families are going to step up. Not to mention the impact this is going to have on the children who are witnessing parents who are taking part equally in family and domestic life. And I think that sets the precedent for the next generation, where those kinds of things are normalized. And it is no longer this stereotypical kind of family where the mom is at home cooking and cleaning and the father goes to work and returns and the meal is ready. So the idea of those types of things that was a very maybe 1950s image of what a family should look like, I think will no longer exist.
Hafsa, you've got the final word today. What should governments in the region and the international community be doing to address these issues? And what are the risks if they don't?
Thanks, Alistair. Firstly, to the risks, obviously, allowing the issue to exacerbate and the situation for, let's face it, more than half of the population in terms of gender balance across the region would be catastrophic. We're talking about social dynamics, political, economic cohesion, mobility. We've already seen the mass mobilization driven very much by young women, particularly over the last decade. And it's simply no longer enough to look at programs of support, whether it be sort of economic support on a high level, national level, or strategic aid support on a sort of lower or very targeted level that does not have gender, not just the buzzwords we like to use, gender mainstreamed, aggregated, etc., but really almost course correction. because of what this pandemic affects, particularly in terms of economic mobilization for women, could do in the longer term. And just on some of the recommendations that can be done, well, first and foremost, is not to cut back on what is already being done. One of the great fears and discussions that I've been having for weeks with a number of local civil society, INGOs, and even among the donor community is that the pandemic is possibly forcing donors to shift and change budget apportionments in foreign aid and development support, primarily to tackle public health issues on a wider scale. It also requires future, mass reform of public health systems. This pandemic has exposed the fact that most of the countries in the region really suffer from a lack of strong public health structures, whether it be physical infrastructure, the systems, and so forth. And finally, sort of building on Lina's point, one thing that's really come out of the pandemic that is positive is that we no longer need the conduits or the vehicles or mechanisms to access local sentiment, local civil society in the way that we used to as practitioners or international community advocates or otherwise as we did before. Basically, all you need is an internet connection. So it is an opportunity for international partners to elevate the voices of those on the ground and elevate local civil society, elevate local advocates, really work on furthering and strengthening local capacity building. We're talking about exposure for women's movements, feminist collectives, etc. But that is across the board for civil society. And this can be a real opportunity for international partners to invest heavily in the capacity and the personnel of local actors who are ultimately committed and invested in this for life, unlike, big picture programs that move on and chop and change and engage at will. So there is opportunity there. There are challenges. There's a need to refocus, retarget, commit, and continue that commitment. And also to think more strategically about how we can provide an effective course correction post the pandemic to ensure that the kind of risks and challenges that have been mentioned today don't become long-term catastrophic fractures in social cohesion.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Hafsa, Burcu, Lina, thank you all for joining the program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.